Hi folks, welcome to the 9th video in the series investigating Moffett Ancestry, and the time has come to find out who Margaret Moffett really was. We can isolate those people who are directly involved with Margaret in the family tree, which is basically George Moffett, her first husband, and Thomas Kirk, her second. I've not included her 9 children at the moment. We can list what we have learnt so far from the various birth, death and marriage certificates. First of all, Margaret was married to George Moffett in 1860 in Carlisle and gives her surname as Armstrong. At the time she was a minor, so under 21. Her father was recorded as Hugh Armstrong, but no occupation is given. The 1861 census gives her age as 18. So suggesting she was born around 1843. For all but one of her children, born especially to George Moffett, the birth certificates record her maiden name as Armstrong. On the birth certificate for Mary, born 1863, her surname is recorded as Houghton. On her marriage certificate to Thomas Kirk in 1901, the name of her father is recorded as Hugh. He was a private in an infantry regiment. And finally, Margaret's age at time of death in December 1917 was 74, so again suggesting she was born in 1843. We now have 2 questions. Where did the Houghton or the Houghton come from? And is Margaret's maiden name Armstrong or Houghton? Or Houghton, or even something else. To which, of course, we can add the question of how do we go about reconciling this and determining which surname is correct? We can begin by looking at the surnames themselves. According to the forebears.io website, there are about 40 worldwide variants of Armstrong, although all the census search engines seem to cope with the most common ones. However, it transpires that there are a large number of variants for Houghton. On the onename.org website, a search for Houghton lists it as one of 156 variants of the Irish surname Houlihan. However, forebears.io increases this to 325. So, following the path of least resistance, and given that first of all, Margaret mostly used the surname Armstrong, and secondly that great-aunt Winnie also thought that a Moffett once married an Armstrong, and thirdly because Armstrong has the fewest variants, we will begin by exploring the Armstrong options. From the various censuses, we know that Margaret was born between 1841 and 1844, but most probably 1843. The entries also consistently record her place of birth as Carlisle. Therefore, a search of the BMD index for a Margaret Armstrong born sometime between 1842 and 1844 in Carlisle results in several possibilities, but the 3 most likely candidates are as follows. There's Margaret born on the 1st of April 1843, to James, a labourer, and Mary, formerly Blenkinsop, living in Willowholme, Colgate, Carlisle. This would make her 17 years old in November 1860 and 18 years old at the time of the 1861 census, which was carried out on the 8th of April 1861. Then there's Margaret born on the 27th of December 1843 to Thomas, a joiner, and Mary, formerly Henderson, living in Houghton, a village to the northwest of Carlisle, but generally included in the area called Stanwix. She would have been 17 years old in November 1860 and 18 years old at the time of the 1861 census. And thirdly, Margaret born on 22nd of June 1844 to John, a cotton spinner, and Elizabeth, formerly Warburton, living in 9 Union Street, Botchgate, Carlisle. This would make her 16 years old in November 1860 and 17 years old at the time of the 1861 census. However, it will be noted that none of these certificates reveal a Hugh Armstrong as a father to a Margaret Armstrong. But we know from the case of James Moffett that a father's first name may not be recorded correctly. So, in the interests of thoroughness, we can assess each of these three possibilities. A search for Margaret Armstrong, born around 1843 in Houghton in the 1861 census, reveals that Margaret, daughter of Thomas a joiner, and Mary, is living at 17 West Walls in the parish of St Mary's in Carlisle. And the fact that the census records Margaret as being born in Houghton means this corresponds to the second Margaret, and so we can remove her from the list. Search of the 1861 census for John and Elizabeth Armstrong is complicated by the fact that there are several married couples called John and Elizabeth Armstrong, two of whom have daughters called Margaret, but they are too young. However, given that the Margaret we are looking for was born in June 1844, she would not have become 74 until June 1918. Perhaps not the strongest argument for elimination, but given that Margaret is recorded as being 74 years old when she died in December 1917, we can remove this Margaret from the list. Consequently, the most likely candidates for the parents of Margaret Armstrong become James and Mary, previously Blenkinsop. However, before investigating this couple further, we need to ask the question, are there any Hugh Armstrongs in the censuses? On the UK Online Census website, a search for Hugh Armstrong living in Carlisle in the 1841 census reveals there is only one Hugh Armstrong, and he's living in Little Lane, Botchgate, Carlisle, and is a cotton stripper. He is very likely married to Christian Armstrong, and both are aged 25 years old, so born around 1816. If he was born around 1816, then he is likely to have married sometime between 1835 and 1841. A search for a marriage involving a Hugh Armstrong reveals that he did in fact marry a Christian Robson on the 22nd of August 1840 in Carlisle. The certificate records Hugh as a cotton stripper, and his father is Thomas Armstrong, a groom. Christian's father is William Robson, deceased, and he was a bricklayer. In the 1851 census, we find only one Hugh Armstrong in Carlisle, and he is 37 years old, so born approximately 1814, and he's a cotton stripper, and he's a widower, and he's living in 171 Bird in the Hand Lane, Castle Street, with his brother-in-law George Graham, who's 30 and a weaver, and his wife Anne, 28, who's a dressmaker. This will be the same Hugh as in the 1841 census. And according to this census, brother and sister Hugh and Anne were born in Carlisle. Interestingly, they are living next door to Thomas Armstrong, aged 66, a pauper, formerly a groom, and his wife Anne, 61. It's possible to suggest that these are Hugh's and Anne's parents, given that Hugh's father on the marriage certificate was also a groom. A search of the GRO index reveals that Christian died on the 17th of July 1848 of a disease of the liver and stomach, and she'd been suffering from this for several years. She was 36 years old and is recorded as the wife of Hugh Armstrong, who was a cotton stripper. In the 1861 census, we find Hugh is living with his mother, working as a labourer at an iron foundry where they are also both living. In the 1871 census, we find he is still living with his mother, but this time at 14 Blackpin Street, Carlisle. Hugh is aged 58 and Anne 79, and he is still a foundry labourer. Neither are found in the 1881 census, and a search of the GRO index reveals that Hugh Armstrong died aged 60 on the 8th of May 1873 at Carlisle Infirmary, with his sister Anne Graham in attendance at his death. His mother, Anne Armstrong, aged 82, died in Carlisle on the 20th of May 1873, so only 12 days later, and with a John Graham present at death. He's possibly a relation of her daughter Anne's husband. However, there is still an absence of evidence that would suggest Hugh and Christian Armstrong had a daughter called Margaret, so it is perhaps correct to conclude that Margaret's father is mistakenly identified as Hugh Armstrong on the marriage certificate. This leaves us with one line of inquiry: James Armstrong and Mary Blenkinsop. A search of the GRO index for other children born to an Armstrong and Blenkinsop does not bring to light anyone born to a James and Mary, although a John is born to a John Armstrong and Jane Blenkinsop on the 21st of April 1849. Consequently, he is not directly related to Margaret. A search for the marriage of an Armstrong and Blenkinsop prior to 1843 in the BMD index also draws a blank. However, a search of the Gretna Green records does reveal suitable candidates married on the 30th of October 1842. This would suggest that one or both of them were underage. And when it comes to the 1851 census, locating James and Mary Armstrong sadly draws a blank. Consequently, without any further evidence, we can probably conclude that James and Mary are not our Margaret's parents. Therefore, we can also conclude that Margaret was not actually an Armstrong. This leaves us with the unenviable task of searching for Houghans, Hullicans and possibly hooligans, which we will do in the next video.